5:30 in the morning, every day for 20 years. The alarm has not been set for 15 of those years. It does not need to be. The body wakes itself, tense, alert, ready. The threat that created this pattern ended decades ago, but the pattern remains, executing without question and without awareness. And when someone asks why this hypervigilance, why the inability to relax, why the stillness feels like danger, the answer comes automatically. It's just who I am. I've always been like this. But what if that is not true? The most unsettling part is not that this pattern exists, but that it feels like you. That's how survival hides. What if the personality you call yours is not a reflection of who you are, but a fossilized response to who you had to become when the world was not safe? What if every trait you defend, every behavior you justify as just how I am, is actually a survival mechanism that never turned off? What if your personality exists only because danger once did? Today we examine the survival identity, the self constructed entirely around threat response rather than authentic preference. We explore how trauma does not just wound you, it architects you, how it builds a personality designed for a world that no longer exists, and why, for those who have lived this way long enough, safety itself becomes the greatest threat of all. As you listen, notice something. When you think about who you are, your temperament, your instincts, your automatic responses, can you trace them back to choice, or do they trace back to necessity, to the moment you learned that being a certain way kept you alive? Notice if your chest tightens when I ask this, because the survival identity is not weakness, it is not pathology, it is extraordinary adaptation. It is the mind and body doing exactly what they were designed to do under conditions of prolonged threat. But adaptation to trauma often looks like dysfunction when the threat has passed, and most people never realize they are still living as if the danger is present, executing defensive strategies against enemies that no longer exist. You didn't choose this, but you have been defending it ever since. Trauma therapist Pete Walker identified something that changed how we understand the aftermath of chronic threat. He found that people who experience prolonged trauma, particularly in childhood, do not just develop symptoms, they develop identities, entire personalities organized around one of four survival responses: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. These are not occasional reactions. These are baseline states, the lens through which everything is filtered, the architecture upon which the self is built. Walker called them the 4 Fs, and he found that most people with complex trauma specialize in one response, hardwiring it so deeply into their personality that it becomes indistinguishable from who they believe they are. Fight. The fight type becomes the person who cannot tolerate disrespect, who is quick to anger, who views relationships as power struggles, who must control every situation because vulnerability feels like annihilation. This is not aggression for its own sake. This is a nervous system that learned early that the world is hostile and that the only way to survive is to be more dangerous than the danger. These individuals often present as narcissistic, domineering, entitled, but beneath the surface is a hypervigilant system scanning constantly for threats of status, for signs of disrespect, for any indication that they are losing control, because control for them is not preference, it is survival. Who would you be if dominance stopped working tomorrow? If this is steering recognition, you are not meant to resolve it right now, just to notice. Flight. The flight type becomes the person who cannot stop moving, who fills every moment with productivity, who works obsessively, achieves compulsively, stays perpetually busy to avoid the terror of stillness. This is not ambition. This is a nervous system that learned that being useful, being indispensable, being in motion is how you stay safe. These individuals often present as successful, high-functioning, admirable, but internally they are running, not toward something, away from the vulnerability that stillness will force them to feel. They are workaholics, perfectionists, achievers who can never rest because rest feels like exposure. What are you running from when you cannot stop achieving? Freeze. The freeze type becomes the person who cannot engage, who dissociates under stress, who withdraws into fantasy, into sleep, into anything that numbs the overwhelming intensity of being present. This is not laziness. This is a nervous system that learned that the only way to survive unbearable situations is to leave the body, to go somewhere else internally while remaining physically trapped. These individuals often present as depressed, unmotivated, detached, but what looks like apathy is actually profound self-protection, the system shutting down to prevent complete psychological collapse. They are not choosing disconnection, they are being pulled into it by a survival mechanism that never learned another option. At this point, most people are trying to decide which one they are. That impulse itself is part of the survival identity. Fawn. And then there is the fawn type, the person who cannot say no, who merges with others' needs, who abandons all boundaries, preferences, and selfhood to keep the peace. This is not kindness, this is a nervous system that learned that compliance is the price of attachment, that your needs do not matter, that your survival depends on making yourself useful, agreeable, indispensable to those who have power over you. These individuals often present as selfless, generous, empathic, but what looks like care is actually self-erasure. They are not giving from abundance, they are giving from terror. The terror that if they stop serving, they will be abandoned, an abandonment for someone whose early survival depended on remaining in the good graces of a dangerous caregiver feels like death. If you stopped being useful, would you still believe you deserved to exist? Notice what your body does when you hear these descriptions. Walker found that these responses do not stay situational. They become the organizing principle of personality. The fight type is not just defensive in moments of threat. They structure the entire life around anticipating and dominating potential threats. The flight type is not just busy when stressed. They have built an identity around relentless productivity. The freeze type is not just dissociative under pressure. They have learned to live half-present, perpetually withdrawn. The fawn type is not just accommodating in conflict. They have no sense of self separate from what others need them to be. This is the survival identity, not a set of symptoms, a way of being, a personality constructed entirely in response to threat. And here's the cruelest part. It works. These adaptations kept you alive. They protected you from dangers that were real. But the cost is that you never developed a self-organized around preference, around desire, around who you might be in the absence of a threat. You only know who you are when danger is present, and when it is not, you feel lost. So who are you when it's gone? Research into trauma and identity formation reveals something profound. Identity, according to developmental psychology, is supposed to emerge through exploration and commitment, through trying different roles, discovering preferences, integrating experiences into a coherent sense of self. But trauma disrupts this process entirely. When safety is not a given, exploration becomes impossible. You cannot discover who you are when all your resources are devoted to staying alive. You cannot develop preferences when every choice is dictated by survival. And so, identity formation does not happen through self-discovery. It happens to threat response. You become who you needed to be to survive, and that version of you, hypervigilant, compliant, withdrawn, combative, becomes mistaken for your authentic self. Studies show that adults who experienced chronic childhood trauma report profound identity confusion. They described feeling like different people in different contexts. They struggle to identify their own preferences, their own values, their own desires separate from what was required of them. When asked who you are, they often respond with roles, with functions, with what they do for others, not with anything intrinsic. Because there was no space to develop anything intrinsic. Survival demanded all available resources, and what emerged was not a self, it was defense, a strategy, a way of being that worked to keep the danger at bay. Researchers call this the trauma-adapted self, an identity structure that prioritizes safety over authenticity. And while this adaptation is intelligent and profoundly resilient, it comes at a cost. You survive, but you do not live. You do not discover the self that comes after survival. You remain frozen in the identity that survival required. If this feels heavy, stay with it. It becomes clearer soon. The paradox deepens because once you have built an entire personality around threat response, safety becomes dangerous. This sounds absurd, but the research is clear. For individuals whose nervous systems were shaped by prolonged trauma, calm registers as unfamiliar, and unfamiliar registers as threat. Your body learned to associate chaos with survival, not because chaos is good, but because chaos was the condition under which your survival strategies made sense. When things were unpredictable, your hypervigilance was adaptive. When danger was constant, your compliance kept you alive. When overwhelm was the norm, your dissociation protected you. But when life becomes stable, when relationships become safe, when there is no immediate threat to manage, your nervous system does not experience relief. It experiences alarm. Calm feels wrong. Silence feels suspicious. Moments of peace trigger anxiety rather than rest, because your identity was built around responding to threat. When the threat is absent, you do not know who you are. And this is where most healing advice quietly fails, because it assumes that safety is the goal, that once you create safe conditions, healing happens naturally. But for someone with a survival identity, safety is not relief, it is disorientation. It is the collapse of the organizing principle that has given your life structure and meaning. Studies of trauma survivals reveal a disturbing pattern. When asked to describe moments of intense distress, many identify periods of calm as more triggering than periods of crisis. One survivor described it as waiting for the other shoe to drop. Another said, "When everything is okay, I know something terrible is about to happen." This is not paranoia. This is a nervous system that learned a specific pattern, calm before the storm. If every period of peace in your childhood was followed by violence, by rage, by abandonment, your body learned to treat peace as a warning sign. The brain, wired for pattern recognition, begins to correlate calm with the onset of danger, and so you sabotage it, not consciously, but your system creates the chaos it knows how to navigate. You pick fights, you create crises, you stay in relationships that are volatile because volatility is familiar. You feel more yourself in turmoil than in tranquility. Because tranquility is where you do not recognize yourself. Tranquility is where the survival identity has no function. And when your identity has no function, you feel like you are disappearing. Nothing needs to be solved right now. But if you feel the urge to dismiss this, notice why. Neuroscience clarifies this mechanism. When researchers examine the brains of individuals with complex trauma, they find specific patterns. The amygdala, the brain's alarm system, is hyperactive. It fires at threats that are not present. It interprets neutral stimuli as dangerous, and it does not easily return to baseline once activated. The hippocampus, responsible for contextualizing memory, often shows reduced volume. This means that traumatic memories are not properly time-stamped. They do not stay in the past. They intrude into the present as if they are happening now. Your body responds to a memory of danger as it is current danger. And the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for rational thought, planning, emotion regulation, shows decreased activity. The survival brain overrides the thinking brain. You react before you can reflect. You defend before you can assess whether defense is necessary. This is not dysfunction. This is a nervous system optimized for an environment where the threats were constant and unpredictable, where hesitation meant harm, where thinking too much could get you hurt. But that optimization persists long after the environment changes, and what was once adaptive becomes the source of profound suffering. Your brain is acting like a smoke alarm that never learned the fire ended. And like any alarm, it's loud not because it's cruel, but because it's afraid you won't survive. You cannot turn it off. You cannot think your way out of it, because it is not a cognitive problem. It is a physiological adaptation. Your body is still living in the war zone even though the war ended years ago. And here is where it becomes most painful. Because recognizing the survival identity means confronting a terrifying question. If you strip away the defenses, what remains? For many people, the answer is almost nothing, or something so small, so fragile, that it feels insufficient to the demands of being a person in the world. The fight type who stops fighting discovers they have no idea how to connect. The flight type who stops running discovers they have no idea what they actually want. The freeze type who stops dissociating discovers they cannot tolerate the intensity of being present. The Fawn type who stops pleasing discovers they have no sense of self at all. This is why people resist changing even when the survival identity causes immense suffering. Because as painful as it is to live in perpetual defense, it is more terrifying to exist without it. The survival identity may be limiting, but it is something. It is an organizing principle. It is a way of being that makes sense. If this defense goes, something essential might die, and the prospect of dismantling it feels like annihilating the only self you have ever known. Therapists who work with complex trauma describe this stage as the most delicate. The client has insight. They understand intellectually that their personality was shaped by trauma, but emotionally, they cannot tolerate the vulnerability of letting it go. Because letting it go means feeling everything it was designed to protect them from. The terror, the helplessness, the grief of a childhood that required them to become someone other than who they might have been. And most people, when they reach this point, retreat. They decide that their survival identity is who they are, that this is just their personality, that change is not worth the cost. This is why most people stop here. This is where people confuse emptiness with failure. You are not late, you are not broken, you just adapted. But if you are willing to continue, there is another possibility. Not a return to some essential self that was always there, not a discovery of who you truly are beneath the defenses, but something more uncertain and more real, the possibility of building the self that comes after survival. This does not mean the survival responses disappear. The nervous system retains what it learned, but it is possible to create choice where there was only reflex, to notice when you are reacting to memory rather than reality, to develop a capacity to assess whether the threat is present before the defenses activate. This work is not cognitive, it is somatic. It requires learning to sense what is happening in your body before the automatic response takes over, to distinguish between the sensation of actual danger and the sensation of remembered danger. It requires expanding what trauma therapists call the window of tolerance, the range within which you can experience sensation without becoming dysregulated. For someone with a survival identity, that window is often narrow. A slight provocation triggers fight. A moment of stillness triggers flight into busyness. Overwhelm triggers freeze. Any conflict triggers fawn. The work is to gradually expand that window, to build capacity to sit with discomfort without immediately deploying the survival response, to tolerate moments of calm without creating chaos, to feel anger without becoming combative, to rest without dissociating, to say no without fearing abandonment. This happens slowly, through thousands of small moments where you notice the impulse and choose differently, not suppressing it, not forcing yourself to be someone you are not, but creating a space between a stimulus and response, between the trigger and the automatic pattern. This doesn't take years to begin. It takes noticing once. 3 core practices support this work. Breath work that signals safety to the vagus nerve, grounding that anchors you in present reality rather than remembered threat, and pendulation, the gentle oscillation between touching into activation and returning to resource, teaching the nervous system that it can encounter intensity without being overwhelmed. And most importantly, relationship. Not just any relationship, but relationships where your survival strategies are not required, where you are not rewarded for fighting, for achieving, for disappearing, for pleasing, where you can exist without function, where you are valued not for what you do, but for the fact that you are. These relationships are rare, and for someone with survival identity, they are almost unbearable, because they require you to show up as something other than the defended self, and you do not know how to do that. But in these relationships, if you can tolerate the discomfort, something begins to shift. You start to notice that safety is possible, that you can be angry without destroying connection, that you can be still without catastrophe, that you can need things without being abandoned, that you can fail without annihilation. And in those moments, however brief, you glimpse the self that comes after survival, not the survival identity, not some idealized authentic self, but a capacity to be present without defense, to respond to what is actually happening rather than what might happen, to exist even momentarily without the weight of perpetual readiness. The person who wakes at 5:30, they begin working with a therapist who understands trauma, not to fix them, not to make them calm, but to help them distinguish between the alarm and the actual threat. They learn to notice when their body tenses, when their thoughts spiral into catastrophe, when the impulse is to prepare for disaster, and they learn, Is the threat here, now, or is this the memory of a threat? Most of the time, it is the memory. And slowly, over months, over years, they begin to sleep past 5:30. Not because they forced themselves, not because they decided to be different, but because their nervous system, through repeated experience of waking up and nothing terrible happening, began to update its assessment of danger. The change is not dramatic. They still wake early sometimes. Their body still carries the imprint of those years, but the imprint is no longer in control. It is information. It is history. It is a part of them, but it is not all of them. And on the mornings when they sleep until 6, until 7, they notice something strange. They do not feel like themselves. The old identity, the vigilant one, the prepared one, protests, tells them they are being lazy, irresponsible, vulnerable, but they stay with it. They let the discomfort exist, and gradually, a different sense of self begins to emerge, one that can rest, one that does not need to be constantly braced, one that is not organized entirely around survival. It is tentative, uncertain, fragile, but it is theirs, not inherited from trauma, not imposed by necessity, chosen. This is the self that comes after survival. You are here because some part of you recognizes this. Some part of you suspects that who you are is not entirely yours, that your personality was shaped by forces beyond your control, that you have been living as if the danger is still present when it is not. And you are right. The survival identity is real, it is powerful, it kept you alive, but it is also a prison, not because it is bad, but because it prevents you from discovering the self that comes after survival. The work is not to eliminate it. You cannot simply decide to stop being vigilant or productive or compliant or withdrawn. These patterns are wired deeply, but you can begin to notice them, to see them as responses rather than as your essential nature, to create a space where choice becomes possible. This does not lead to certainty. It leads to the recognition that you do not know who you are outside of your survival mode, to the grief of recognizing how much of your life has been organized around threats that are no longer present. But it also leads to something else, to moments where you respond to what is actually happening rather than what you fear might happen, to relationships where you are seeing rather than defended, to a life that is not constantly braced for catastrophe. The survival identity will resist this. It will tell you that letting go of vigilance means danger, that rest is weakness, that vulnerability is annihilation, and part of you will believe it, because that part of you is still living in the past. But you can learn to distinguish between that voice and the reality of your present circumstances. You can build the capacity to tolerate safety, to exist without constant defense, to become the self that comes after survival. This is not about becoming softer. It is about becoming freer. Take a breath before the next thing you do. If you are here, you are already questioning whether your personality is survival or self. Subscribing can be a way of staying in the question. If this resonated, if you recognized yourself in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, if you felt the truth that calm can feel more threatening than chaos, take a moment to like this video. Subscribe for more investigations into the hidden architecture of identity. The survival identity is not your fault, but it is your responsibility. And the work of separating who you became from who you might be is the work of reclaiming your life from a threat that no longer exists.